Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Today we are starting a new panel of witnesses. This panel is addressing decision-making and advisory processes relating to Fraser River sockeye. We have with us today Mr. Wayne Sato, who's here representing the province. We have Jerry Christensen, who is here as a member of the Sports Fishing Advisory Board, and Mr. Pat Matthew, who's with the Secwepemc Tribal Council. Those witnesses can now be sworn in.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I so affirm.
I so affirm.
I so affirm.
State your name, please.
My name's Gerald Lawrence Christensen, normally addressed as Jerry.
My name is Wayne Shuya Saito.
Patrick Lewis Matthew.
Thank you. Council?
Thank you. I'll just run through a little bit of background with each of you gentlemen. I'll start with Mr. Sato. Now, Mr. Sato, you have a long history in fisheries in BC. I don't want to get into too much detail on your past. You're here as a representative of the province today, but I will just highlight a few things. You started back in the IPSFC in the 1970s, is that right, as a management support biologist?
That's correct.
And you moved to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in 1986?
That is correct.
And you stayed in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans right through to 2005?
That is correct. I retired in November the 1st of 2004.
2004, okay. And during that time you were at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, you held many different positions, and one of the positions that you had just prior to your retirement was chair of the Canadian chair of the Fraser River panel?
That is correct.
Right, and following that, after your retirement from DFO, you moved to the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries and the Ministry of the Environment at the province of BC, is that right?
That is correct.
And you've continued to be involved in fisheries issues in that role with the province ever since?
Yes, I have been.
All right, and you're here today to talk about, the questions I'll be asking you are in relation to your role as a provincial representative.
Thank you.
Dr. Christensen, you have a doctorate in political science.
That's correct.
And you have a long history with the sport fishery community in BC, is that right?
That is correct.
You are the chair of the Sports Fisher Advisory Board?
I am, yes.
And you're also, and have been since 1998, a commissioner with the Pacific Salmon Commission.
That is correct, as well as the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission.
And you have been a representative for the Sports Fisher Advisory Board at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee?
That is correct.
I will come back to Mr. Sato's biography. I meant to mark it and I didn't, but I'll just, while I'm with you, Dr. Christensen, at tab 5 of the binder before you is a copy of a biography you provided us.
Yes, it is.
And if that sets out your history and your involvement with fisheries in BC.
Yes, it does.
All right, I'd like that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 376.
And Mr. Sato, I meant to mark your biography as well, your CV, before we left you. That's at tab 3 of the material before you. And this is a copy of your CV. It's setting out your experience in the fisheries world in BC, is that right?
That is correct.
All right, I'd like that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 377.
Thank you. And Mr. Matthew, I think I incorrectly identified you as a member of the Secwepemc Tribal Council. You're actually a member of the Secwepemc Fisheries Commission, is that right?
That's right. The Secwepemc Fisheries Commission is a part of the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council.
So, sorry, I apologize for that. You also have a long history of fishing experience in BC, particularly in the Thompson Fraser Rivers, over 30 years of experience in that area.
That's correct.
And since 1998 to the present, you've been the Fisheries Management Coordinator for the Secwepemc Fisheries Commission?
I believe it's 1988.
1988?
I believe it is.
Thank you. And in that role, you're involved in coordination of consultation and engagement on fisheries management issues on behalf of the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council?
That's correct.
And you have been involved in other aspects of fisheries management going back into the 1970s as a fisheries guardian and as a fisheries technician, latter one for the Central Interior Tribal Council.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And you've provided us with a CV, and that's found at tab 6 of the binder in front of you. Okay. This is the CV that you provided us, setting out your qualifications and history.
That's correct.
All right, I'd like that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 378.
Thank you. We have had evidence already in this commission from Mr. Grout and from Mr. Rosenberger on the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee process. So we've heard an overview of how that process works, what the meetings are, and how the IFMP is developed from the Department of Fishery and Oceans perspective. So we've asked you to come today and provide your own experiences in those processes. Because we've had that background, I'm going to jump right into some of those processes without too much background being established. So I'll start with the integrated harvest planning process. First of all, the terms of reference for the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee have been marked as an exhibit in this proceeding as Exhibit 342. The question I want to ask you is not what is in the terms of reference of this committee, but what I want to ask each of you is, what do you see as the purpose of this committee as a participant in that process? So I'll start, if I can, with you, Mr. Matthews. What do you see as the purpose of this IHPC process?
Well, my understanding of it is that it's an advisory process to the minister from the sectors that are involved at the meetings.
Do you see it as a decision-making committee or as an advisory committee?
I see it as a advisory committee.
Okay. Mr. Sato, how would you respond to that question?
I have no disagreement with...
I'm sorry, could you turn your mic on? Thank you. And it needs to be fairly close to your mouth as well. Thank you.
I have no disagreement with what Mr. Matthews has indicated. I would add, perhaps, or embellish a bit by suggesting it is intended or designed to provide advice to the Department of Fisheries regarding the efficacy of fishing plans in the preseason, and to comment on the achievement of objectives in the postseason sense. I also suggest that one of the primary focuses is to identify areas of competing and conflicting interests, and to engage in discussions to perhaps, to the extent possible, resolve them.
And Dr. Christensen?
Yes, thank you. I think I would simply add, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I would add, though, that I think from the recreational perspective, the role just mentioned by Mr. Sato is the key one. From our perspective, the process, we work with the department to develop proposed recreational fishing plans. The IHPC is the place where we can meet with the other harvest sectors and the conservation group to work through the places where those plans intercede or conflict. So it's to get at that aspect of things that is particularly valuable and important to us.
The fishing plans that you just discussed, are those the fishing plans which will find their way into the IFMP, the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan?
That is correct. From our perspective, the way it works is that at the local level and through our regional bodies, individuals bring forward proposals for the operation of fishing plans. The SFAB has the overall role of integrating those in order to work with the department in the development of a recreational fishing plan. Now, or recreational fishing plans is probably a better answer, because there are a series of those. From our perspective, then, once we've reached some agreement with the department on what we would like to see happen, it's appropriate that those go before the IHPC so that the commercial harvest sector, First Nations, and the conservation movement can comment on them, question them, etc.
Ms. Baker, I wonder if you could just at this point, just so it informs me, when they say "we," that they're attending meetings and so that we can accomplish something, who are they speaking for?
Okay,
exactly?
sure. When you're talking about the IHPC, who's the we? Who are you representing?
Yes, I am one of the 6 representatives from the chosen by the Sport Fishing Advisory Board to sit on the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, 3 from the north and 3 from the south. And so when I say we, I am speaking of the Sport Fishing Advisory Board.
And Mr. Matthew?
I guess I have a comment about the sectors bringing forward fishing plans to the IHPC. I from the Sequetum, have brought forward a fishing plan that describes our fishery, our harvest targets, our conservation objectives, and recommendations to meet those. And as far as I could tell, and maybe I can be corrected, but I have not seen a similar type of fishing plan brought forward by the other sectors to the IHPC meeting for full review. So maybe I'm incorrect in saying that, but I don't see that process happening at the IHPC where people, the commercial or recreational or the conservation sector, bring forward a fishing plan that describes how they're going to protect various stocks within the fishery in their plans. Maybe it's there, maybe I'm missing it.
And when you attend at the IHPC, just to follow up with what the Commissioner asked, who are you representing?
I'm representing the Sequetum Fisheries Commission, and which represents only those First Nations in the Thompson area, and I guess those fish stocks within the Thompson Basin within our area.
Okay. And Mr. Sato, you are representing the province?
And I represent the province of British Columbia.
And we know from our earlier discussions with Mr. Grout and Mr. Rosenberger that there are representatives from the commercial sector also involved in the IHPC, correct?
That is correct, yes, representing the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board.
And there's also representatives from the Marine Conservation Caucus, or the environmental groups?
That is correct. And if I could, Ms. Baker, I think the issue that Pat has raised is one that deserves comment. From our perspective, when I use the phrase fishing plan, I'm referring to what is in the draft integrated harvest plan that comes before the IHPC for comment. So our fishing plan, and I assume I think the same is true for the commercial sector, is incorporated into the draft integrated harvest plan.
Okay, and that is something different, Mr. Matthew, from what you've described.
I would imagine. I don't get to, I guess I'm not clear on how the discussion evolves around that in terms of seeing how the other sectors fishing plans are actually incorporated, or the discussion goes on about how they're incorporated into the IFMP. To me, it's not clear how it happens, or sort of the outcomes of that from the meeting.
Okay, let me cover a few more preliminary issues, and then we'll get into some of the content of what happens at those meetings. At a preliminary level, I've described the people who are present at the IHPC currently, and my question to the panel is: are all the people at the table, at the IHPC table, who need to be there? So who are the people that you think need to be at the table to make this process work? And I'll start with you, Dr. Christensen.
I think at the present time, the composition of the IHPC is appropriate. There are representatives there of the 3 harvest groups, and there are representatives there of the what the self-described conservation sector in the form of the MCC.
Mr. Sato?
I also believe that the appropriate parties have the opportunity of being represented and participating in this process.
Okay. And Mr. Matthew?
I think that First Nations are not adequately represented at the IHPC. Myself represents only the our interest in the Thompson for Secretman communities. There is no representation from the Middle Fraser, the other tribes in the area, and or the Lower Fraser. The Lower Fraser, I believe, had applied to have a representative, and the response from DFO was that, I believe, I can be corrected, that they would leave it to First Nations to sort of organize our representation there and perhaps use the First Nation Fish Council process to do that. So at this point, I don't believe that First Nations are adequately represented there. We have not developed sort of a coordinated approach amongst First Nations on the Fraser or the South Coast to do that, although that is in the works in other processes. The other folks that I don't believe are represented there, I can be corrected on that, is the sort of the South Coast Marine First Nations.
Is the process for appointing people to the IHPC understood by the parties or understood by the sectors, and is it a fair process? I'll start again with you, Mr. Christensen.
Well, I could speak directly only with respect to my own sector, the recreational sector, and certainly in our case, the process is transparent and fair. The 6 representatives are elected as part of the main board process of the, well, actually the regional and main board process of the SFAB. So I can't speak directly to the other sectors as to how people get there.
All right. Do you have an understanding then? You do not, I take it, have an understanding of how other people are appointed to represent those sectors?
Well, I guess I'm being careful because you asked whether it was fair. I'm reluctant to comment on subjectively on it, but I believe that the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board has a process somewhat similar to the one the SFAB operates. I think the same is true of the Marine Conservation Caucus. Clearly, there is a problem with respect to how First Nations are chosen to come to the table, and that's been well articulated by Pat, and I think the rest of us have sympathy with the difficulty that First Nations face in determining their membership at that table.
Okay. Mr. Sato?
I've had the privilege of participating in both the commercial and recreational fishing sector processes, so I'm aware of how individuals are identified and can affirm that the process is by election. I am less familiar with how the Marine Conservation Caucus nor First Nations identify or appoint members, so I can't comment on whether it is fair or not. And I use fair, I guess, within the context that it is a democratic and elected process.
For the commercial and
the recreational fishing sectors.
Thank you. Mr. Matthew?
I can't comment on the other sectors, but I guess as far as being fair, I believe DFO has made many attempts to try to allow First Nations to provide representatives there in whatever fashion they can or will. So I think they've made attempts at it, maybe not formally. So I guess it's fair as far as that's concerned. I mentioned earlier, First Nations are or have been attempting to try to sort of coordinate our representation there. At the November IHPC meeting, the First Nation Fish Council representative attended, and we had a caucus meeting of First Nations there, and where First Nation Fish Council is trying to coordinate, I guess, an effort to sort of determine representation from the First Nations side, although I haven't really heard any actions to date on that. So, but as far as being fair, I believe DFO is attempting to do that.
How is it that you were appointed? How is First Nations representation currently being appointed to the IHPC?
Well, I wasn't appointed. I heard about the IHPC process, and of our own accord, I went to a meeting to observe, and I guess we were concerned with the IHPC process and its purpose and mandate, and how it might impact our Aboriginal interests around the fishery. So I attended one of the meetings, and at that time there were very few other First Nations attending from the lower or middle Fraser, or upper Fraser for that matter, and so DFO asked me to continue to attend. I'm not sure if I'm appointed, or I guess I'm an observer, but when I'm there, I only speak on behalf of our interests in my area for my communities. I don't represent the other First Nation interests.
Are there any other First Nations that participate in the IHPC?
Marcel Shepherd does on behalf of the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance. That's many of the First Nation tribal organizations above sort of Williams Lake and north. Other than that, none on a consistent manner. Murray Ned represents a group of Lower Fraser First Nations that are currently involved in establishing an Arum group, and at this point I believe he's only attending as an observer. As far as the northern IHPC, I'm not clear on how they're represented with First Nations.
Are there representatives from the Nuchalnath on the IHPC?
I believe Don Hull might represent the Nuchalnath. I'm not sure how other First Nations from the approach areas, Vancouver Island, sort of the lower coast, are represented within that group.
Do you think it's important that all First Nations who have an interest in the harvest of Fraser River sockeye have some kind of representation at the IHPC, whether through a mandate given to a representative or individually, or is the bilateral discussion that the DFO has with First Nations adequate?
I guess the issue with the IHPC for First Nations is that it's what's called a third-party process, and many First Nations believe that their interests around fisheries management should be represented in a government-to-government fashion with DFO or some other form of federal government, and in a bilateral fashion. And that's one of the issues with First Nations attending to this process, is that it may not be the appropriate place they believe to have their Aboriginal rights interests dealt with in a fashion with DFO.
There's a predominantly, the members of the IHPC are predominantly harvest-based members. Do you think that the IHPC is too heavily weighted in favor of harvesting interests, given that they make up the bulk of the membership? Mr. Christensen?
Given that it's the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, no, I do not think that it's too heavily weighted to harvest. I do think that it was appropriate for the department to include the self-described conservation group through the Marine Conservation Caucus, and frankly, it's been helpful to have those people in the room as a balance. But it is a harvest committee, and its primary interest is in discussing harvesting issues.
Thank you, Mr. Sato.
I agree with Dr. Christensen in that I do not believe that it is too heavily weighted. As a matter of fact, I'm personally of the view that there are a number of instances where if there was a broader representation of specific and knowledgeable harvest interest, that more refined fishing plans could have been developed and opportunities were lost.
Sorry, can you explain that?
There are situations where local knowledge could have added to a situation here where specific opportunities might have been seized when the opportunities arose, but were not described in decision rules and that are part of the integrated fisheries management plan itself. I agree that there is a need to ensure that the needs of the resource are adequately provided for, but there is also a need to ensure that the fishing plans are refined as carefully and as accurately as possible. And I think that some opportunities could have been lost in the past.
Can you give an
Mr. Mc-
example?
Sorry?
Can you give an example so I understand what you're talking about?
An example is that there is a policy in place by the Department of Fisheries, and a sound one, selective fishing policy. If there's a demonstrated capacity by a particular fishing group to respond to an identified abundance that might occur in season that might have been planned for, or an unexpected bonus, so to speak. If the capacity is not there to respond in terms of a decision rule, then that opportunity is foregone. One specific instance, perhaps, that I can refer to is that I'm aware of is that there was a proposal or a concept being suggested by the Area B Seine group to fish in the Fraser River when the opportunities arose. The conversation did not take place to the point where that kind of a decision rule or that capacity could have been responded to if the abundance and circumstances provided for it.
That situation that you've just described, is that, we've heard a little bit about a proposal in 2002 to fish in the river by the Area B. Is that what you're referring to?
I can't with any great certainty refer to the specific year, and if it was 2002, then perhaps it was. I thought it was more recent than that. I thought it was actually more in the order of 2006, but again, I can't state with certainty which year, but I'm familiar with that circumstance.
Okay, Mr. Matthew? The question was, do you think the IHPC is too heavily weighted in favor of harvesting?
I do. I don't think you can separate conservation from harvest. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the discussion at the IHPC is about harvesting and harvest opportunities. I don't hear a lot of the discussion being about how the sectors are going to develop conservation plans or measures within their own groups to protect stocks of concern. Those are identified in the IFMP, but I don't hear a lot of discussion about how in particular each sector is going to do that at the meetings. I guess the only thing that I hear or discussed a lot is about harvesting and the pilot projects that DFO and sectors work on, including our own, and are really about how to reorganize the fishery in terms of share-based fishing, those sorts of things, the administration of the fishery. Those pilot projects aren't about conservation. They don't describe within their fishing plans how they're going to protect stocks, what data they're going to collect to do that in the marine areas or in other areas. Our fishery, our commercial fishery, had in the last couple of years in Kamloops Lake, DFO forced us to collect DNA and scale data, manage our fishery in a selective manner to protect weak stocks. And we've attempted to do that. And I don't see those same measures being applied or talked about at the IHPC.
Are any of those conservation measures that you described contained within the IFMP document itself?
Well, I guess in the IFMP document, there are sort of precautionary rules or options that are described in there in the pre-season in the document. And as the season progresses and fork run size data is collected, various rules are implemented in season to protect stocks at given levels, and so those are for sockeye are described in an escapement plan that where DFO provides several options for each of the stocks in terms of cutoff levels, benchmarks, those sorts of things. So they're describing what they expect First Nations and others to do in the pre-season is choose an option that we think might meet our best interest, and so some First Nations are able to do that. A lot of those options that are described in there are developed through very technical processes like frizzy and other processes that First Nations and I believe are having difficulty understanding the implications to the fishery for that season and into the future. So, the IFMP is sort of the process that we're all trying to address in the IHPC process, and I think there's difficulties there for First Nations to be able to effectively participate in that.
Question I wanted to ask, which is whether the IHPC and the development of the IFMP, whether those processes provide an opportunity for meaningful input from the different sectors. And maybe I can just ask you if you have anything to add to your previous comments, Mr. Matthews.
For First Nations, I don't believe so. For one, we're not adequately represented there, as I've talked about, and our responses to the IFMP at this point aren't in any sort of coordinated fashion, and I guess DFO represents the IFMP in terms of sockeye in many cases in a very technical sense, where they've developed escapement plans and harvest opportunities are described, precautionary sort of rules or principles, those sorts of things. They're derived from the frizzy process that many First Nations are not clear about it, or in opposition to it, not clear how it functions, and not clear how it'll meet sort of their objectives. So it's very difficult to provide meaningful input when there's sort of an underwriting opposition to how some of those management measures have been developed, I guess, in other places and other forums.
Just before I move to the other witnesses, do you find that we heard from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that they have provided funding to assist First Nations in retaining people with technical expertise to help understand the frizzy model, that they come and meet with First Nations to describe the model and explain how it works? Do any of those processes assist the First Nations in understanding how the models run and how these options are developed?
No, we have, I guess, a couple of biologists that work for FRAS, for the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat, that have attempted to describe those models, describe the frizzy process and some of the, I guess, the potential outcomes, how fishing plans this year what they might mean to productivity into the future. And as far as I'm concerned, First Nations aren't in agreement with it. There's been opposition to the frizzy model and basically how it's been sort of built by DFO, even though there was First Nations participation. I guess the other part of it, DFO has come to the Fraser First Nations in various forms and attempted to describe frizzy and how it functions and works. But many of the problems that First Nations have are understanding sort of the technical jargon, the modeling approach, and sort of the precautionary measures, the risk measures that DFO is trying to employ, and how they quantify them is part of the problem. And very difficult for First Nations to understand that, and very difficult for First Nation or DFO to describe that. So last year, frizzy was going to be discussed at what used to be PSARC, and that was DFO's answer to First Nations in terms of how do you want to get involved. You go to PSARC and sit there and try to understand it from that level. And they've come to many meetings, and they have not been able to clearly describe how our interests are going to be sort of incorporated or accommodated in the frizzy process, especially in terms of individual stocks or CUs and how they're going to be addressed in the frizzy process, in the models. And those, I guess, for First Nations, individual stocks or CUs are what we depend on for our harvesting. And right now, the frizzy model is based on large aggregates of stocks, of which management measures are applied. Cutoff points, harvest plans, escapement benchmarks are all based on these large aggregates. And for us, that's a serious problem in terms of trying to protect our interest around individual stocks. And we've asked DFO, can you describe to us how you're going to accommodate the modeling for individual stocks in your frizzy plans? And they have not been able to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Sato. The question again was, do the processes, the IHPC process and the IFMP development process, provide an opportunity for meaningful input from the sectors?
I don't have the depth of knowledge of the impact that reduced funding and support to the sectors have on their ability to provide that continuing and meaningful input. But I would comment that my observations of how the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board and Sport Fishing Advisory Board, there are opportunities for meetings and discussions at the local and community levels, have been diminished over time. And I believe it's having an impact on their ability to provide a coordinated and balanced approach to fishing plans. And I believe that the importance and the value of the umbrella organizations or umbrella processes, as I describe it, the main board, the Sport Fishing Advisory Board, and the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board, the true value of those processes were to try to find some sort of give and take, some sort of balance between the interests and objectives, between perhaps competing harvest interests, whether it be area geographically or fishery type based. And I believe that the initial successes of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee were in finding those balances. And so it took a long time to say yes, but I'm concerned about the diminishing resources being withdrawn
Can you give examples of that, what you're referring to when you say resources are being withdrawn?
Funding support to address travel costs and meeting costs, to have meetings of the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board, similarly so for the Sport Fishing Advisory Board, perhaps at the local level. The support is gradually being diminished, and not withdrawn, but diminished due to budget restraints and constraints.
In your observation as a member of the IHPC, do you see the sectors being able to provide meaningful input within the context of those meetings and that process?
I believe at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee meetings, yes, the participants there, the process is fortunate to have long-standing members that have an understanding and appreciation of the issues and are able to provide that input, yes.
All right, and Dr. Christensen?
I think I'd like to address this on three levels. The Sport Fishing Advisory Board needs to be understood as a volunteer body. There are no paid staff, there are no paid members. Everyone is a volunteer. But the strength of the SFAB is that we're able to draw on a wide constituency of anglers from across the province who attend local board meetings in 24, 25 local committees, who then elect representatives to a regional board, to two regional boards, and who then elect representatives to the main board, with the attempt to maintain a careful balance in which a majority in the room is always what we describe as the primary sector, that is anglers whose only interest is fishing, as opposed to people whose economic interests are related to fishing. That we describe as the secondary sector. But the SFAB is a balance of those two constituencies. And so at the human resources level, I'm happy to say we're able to draw on a variety of people with enormous knowledge local knowledge of fishing, often technical background from previous parts of their life, people who worked in government, in fisheries, etc. So at that level, we're well represented, and I think our contribution in fora like the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee is effective. At the technical level, we have no technical support, and frankly, I'm not sure that we want technical support. In other words, the SFAB tends to view the department as playing the technical role. We want the department to be well supported with resources so that it can do the science and technical work that we can then relate to. And frankly, I guess at the personal level, I have some concern about the creation of dueling technical bodies where, technicians who work for one interest are dueling with the technicians from another interest. I tend to view the role of government as being the broker of those things and be able to provide impartial and objective scientific background, which I'm happy to say is almost always the case with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and with entities like PSARC, or as it's now called, CSAP, in which we attend those science meetings. I attend them as a lay person, in that I have no degree in biology, but it allows us to build a group of people who can ask the right questions and understand the data when it's in front of us. So at that level, then, my only concern is with the availability of those resources to the department. At the financial level, though, there is a problem, and with respect to the organization and operation of the Sport Fishing Advisory Board. Department of Fisheries and Oceans at one point had a recreational fisheries division which related to recreational fisheries. That has been truncated over the years to where it's really just a few staff and part-time staff positions. The SFAB process works because the department has funded the travel of its participants. So people donate their time, as I do, probably in my case a couple of hundred days a year, but I do that happily because I don't have to pay my travel and accommodation expenses when participating on behalf of the department. But presently the license fees for recreational angling account for about 50% of all the department's expenditures on recreational fishing, probably the highest proportion of any sector. But we have been asking the department for at least 6 years to please increase the license fees so that we can have more money available for catch monitoring, for our contribution to the process. And we have been unable to make that happen because of an iniquitous piece of legislation in Ottawa, a private bill, not a private member's bill rather, not a public bill, called the User Fee Act, which appears to have stymied the department, which is unable to collect more money from recreational anglers in order to support the activities that recreational anglers believe should take place and want to have happen.
Thank
I
you.
apologize for going on. It's like this is a subject I feel a little passionate about.
I can see that. We've talked a little bit about how in the IHPC process, First Nations are not fully represented. Those First Nations on the Fraser River system are not fully represented. And so this is a broad question for the panel. Can the IHPC process be effective as it's currently constituted without that full representation from First Nations? Mr. Sato?
In my personal opinion, yes, provided that the process understand and respect the fact that there are going to be people that can accurately and credibly anticipate the views and the responses that First Nations would provide if the conversation were to take place between the Department of Fisheries and those First Nations at a bilateral level. In other words, not to make the decision so much as to anticipate and respect where various the positions that might be taken.
Mr. Christensen or Dr. Christensen?
Well, I believe your question was if First Nations are not fully represented, and I guess the difficulty is in definition of the word fully. The original plan was that there be 4 First Nations from the north and 4 from the south, and along with the numbers from other communities. And I suspect that in the original iteration, those numbers did not seem unreasonable in the context of representation. But clearly, the problem is that it's difficult for First Nations to delegate people to a forum like the IHPC as representatives, given that individual First Nations have individual constitutional status. And so, I think that the inability of ensuring effective representation, there are some, I don't want to make it sound like there aren't some excellent First Nations representatives there now, but to ensure that there's a full slate of First Nations representatives, possibly more if that's needed to cover the numbers. Frankly, we have no objection. The IHPC is a body based on consensus, so it's not voting, so the number of persons in the room isn't a key issue. And so if one could ensure that First Nations felt they were better represented by either some more people or a better process for choosing them, I think that would work well for the rest of us who are in the room, who feel that often it's hard for people like Pat to speak on behalf of a diverse constituency, given that there isn't a process by which they are, in effect, delegated to operate in that constituency. I have the benefit as both an IHPC rep and as the SFAB chair that when I say the SFAB believes, there is that statement has some validity in that there's a representative process behind me. I think it would be good if we could build a similar support for First Nations in the IHPC process and other processes.
Has the IHPC process to date then been successful because there has been this difficulty in full representation from First Nations?
Well, obviously from the point of view of First Nations, there has not been full representation, but I think the IHPC has worked reasonably well. I think that it's led to the building of relationships between the sectors which were not possible before because this kind of forum did not exist. And so I think that having concern about how to improve First Nations representation should not be interpreted as criticism of the achievements the IHPC has made to date.
Mr. Matthew?
The question, please?
I asked if I guess it's sort of a two-part question. One, can the process be successful if First Nations are not fully represented at the IHPC? Is the first part. And the second part is the one that Dr. Christensen just addressed, is has the process been successful to date, notwithstanding the fact that there has been an inadequacy potentially of representation from First Nations?
I guess the first part about can it be successful without First Nations, I think that it goes to the mandate and purpose of the IHPC if it's simply an advisory process to the minister, and the First Nations we're coordinated to come there and use it as just another venue to put forward our conservation and harvest interest. It may function in that manner if it's just simply a venue to do that. But as I mentioned earlier, First Nations, for the most part, as far as I can understand, don't see it as a place to discuss how their fishing plans or conservation objectives. Maybe I need to start again on that, but I guess they don't see it as a place to discuss their interest around fishing rights. And one of the problems with the IHPC is that there's an understanding, and I believe it's in the terms of reference, that those discussions about First Nations fishing rights or their interest around conservation and management will have taken place at other venues before the IHPC with DFO in a bilateral sense, and that they're already taken care of in another situation, and that those things should not be discussed at the IHPC. But the problem in that is where the IHPC is meant to discuss the IFMP, in which their conservation measures and I guess fishing plans, those sorts of things are in the document that have potential impact in how they're dealt with to First Nations fishing interests. So there's all kinds of, I guess, problems with, I guess, the purpose and intent of the IHPC as First Nations are concerned. So I'm not sure if I answered the question about representation, but
I think that answers the questions I asked.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but again, I'm sure these witnesses and many of the council in the room have enough background and understanding of the structure of the politics of all of the parties who are participating in this process, but I do not. So I just want to make sure I understand a couple of things. One is Mr. Christensen's remark about asking the right questions, but not having necessarily advisors to advise on what are the right questions to ask. In other words, scientists on one side of the table, laypersons on the other side of the table. The other area that I would find interesting is Mr. Matthews' remarks this morning. If he could explain to me who is out there organized into either fisheries councils or fisheries committees within the First Nations communities. In other words, what is the structure out there? And I'm sure this will be coming up later in the Commission's hearings under the Aboriginal fisheries, but just so I can understand your comments a few moments ago, I'm not fully apprised of who all the players are and how you would take this IHPC format or forum and relate it back to all of the parties who are in the process of discussing, you said fishing rights and so on, and I think I understand what you're talking about, but I want to make sure I understand what you're talking about. I just want to make sure I'm following your comments, because it's important for me to understand the context in which you're making your comments.
Well, could you maybe address the last comments by the Commissioner?
well, I guess as far as First Nations, processes, at this point, many of them are in development and emerging. So, sort of at the BC-wide level, there's the First Nation Fisheries Council, which is a body that was born of a political will amongst the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the AFN, and another group called the First Nations Summit. These are sort of pretty well all the political bodies in BC for First Nations at sort of a higher level with chiefs. And so that organization, the First Nation Fisheries Council, has a staff. It's fairly new. They are in the process of developing representation sort of geographically in BC, in the Fraser and other areas. They are now just developing work plans in terms of a working group structure and an MOU that they have with Department of Fisheries and Oceans on several topics, of which co-management is one of them. There's several others. So they're now just developing that sort of process, and so our First Nation is involved and has representation there. So that's sort of the BC-wide First Nations, one of the BC-wide First Nation structures. The other on the Fraser is an organization called the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat, which is made up of First Nations and Department of Fisheries and Oceans in a sort of a bilateral arrangement. And so there are representatives for First Nations from several areas on the Fraser and the approach areas. And underneath that, they've developed a technical working group, or a joint technical working group with Department of Fisheries and Oceans to address, I guess, the sort of the science and management around key questions. The other process is that FRAFS is helping to coordinate our a process called the Fraser Forum, which is a bilateral process between First Nations and DFO to discuss sort of annual operational plans around the fishery, which includes all salmon species. I guess it's used to inform the IFMP as well. So that process is going on. Out of that process, also there's the First Nations have a First Nations only side of the forum process where they try to review and understand annual plans from the IFMP. So they go through a structured process to do that, and with DFO. So there's that, I guess, the forum process. The latest process that First Nations and DFO are working on is it's called the roadmap process, and it's a process to try to explore a possible arrangement with DFO on joint fisheries management on the Fraser River. So the First Nations also are trying to align themselves in what we call a Tier 1 process, which is First Nations only, to do that. The other First Nations process that's sort of reinventing itself on the Fraser is called the Intertribal Treaty Organization. And historically there was a treaty amongst First Nations on the Fraser in the mid to late 80s that was signed by many of the Fraser First Nations, and the treaty is still in existence amongst the Fraser tribes. what they're trying to do with the Intertribal Treaty Organization is to get the treaty, I guess, implemented and get support for it to start again. So, if I'm not mistaken, those are sort of the larger organizations. Many First Nations have tribal councils, of which communities or native bands belong to, and there's on the Fraser, there's probably, I would say, 8 large tribal groups on the Fraser, of which some of them are organized into tribal councils, or maybe 2 tribal councils per First Nation. Some of those tribal councils or organizations are involved in AROM agreements. An example is the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance, where they have several tribes and many First Nation communities involved in an AROM program. Ourselves are in that same AROM agreement with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Many of the communities at a tribal council or band level are involved in Aboriginal fishery strategy and get funding to do stock assessment, provide some support for technicians and biologists. Our own agreement is through AROM, and persons such as myself are supported to help our communities organize ourselves around fisheries management and consultation, those sorts of things.
Overview that there's a lot to cover in that area, and we do have a number of days coming up where we'll get into all of those, understand all of those processes in quite a bit of detail. So I think it's very helpful as an overview, but I know that we will be coming back and spending quite a bit of time on those different processes in some depth. So.
The reason I asked was for my purposes, the remarks being made this morning by this panel, Ms. Baker, is when questions are asked of Mr. Matthew in particular about whether the system is fair, IHPC, and whether the representation is fair and whether it's supportive enough and full enough, is just for me to understand who in the different levels of politics within the First Nations is involved in actually addressing the IHPC, and who's involved in putting persons forward. And it just wasn't clear to me who Mr. Matthew was speaking about when the word First Nations is used. I appreciate there are many persons involved in this process, but I didn't understand, to put his answers in context, just exactly who's being referred to in these answers.
Right. In fact, I think it may be useful then in just clarifying, when we're talking about the questions I'm asking you on the IHPC, you have indicated that you're representing the Secwepemc Fisheries Commission and the Shuswap people. Are you representing people other than that in the IHPC process?
I am not. I'm representing the Secwepemc Fisheries Commission or the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council, of which there are 9 communities that live in the Thompson Basin, and I only represent those communities and their fishing interest in that area. I do not represent any other First Nations on the Fraser.
Right. So I think that the questions that we're talking about today are identifying that limited representation and trying to understand whether that is adequate within that process, given that there are many other First Nations involved in the Fraser River sockeye, with interest in Fraser River sockeye. And the Commission will be coming back to talk about the First Nations processes throughout the Fraser River watershed and how they're involved in management issues. But what we're trying to parse apart in terms of our hearing plan is to talk about today about the IFMP and the IHPC and what input goes into those processes and the final document, who comments are coming from in the development. And we heard from DFO already about the bilateral discussions that they have with different First Nations outside the IHPC full meetings. Now we're hearing from Mr. Matthew as to what he contributes and gains from that process and who he represents in that process. And he's identified is very limited representation in that process. So the question at the end of the day will be whether that is adequate or not. And we have heard from DFO, and we will hear again from DFO on the participation of First Nations in the decision-making process outside the IHPC meetings and that process. So it is a bit awkward, but we have tried to address it in that way to try and at least draw that distinction as to what's happening in that Integrated Harvest Planning Committee process itself and the development of the IFMP within that process. So that's where these questions have been directed at, for the most part, is at that IHPC process, and the people that are in that process, how well can they understand what's being presented to them for decision making, and how well is that process working for them. We started a bit late today. I don't know if you want to take a break this morning, if you want to press on, or what do you want to do?
I'm content to go further if you're
Yep.
comfortable.
Mr. Matthew, I did have one follow-up question on, is there value for you and for your community in your attendance at the IHPC meetings?
I guess at the IHPC, the value I found is that there's a lot of information on fisheries management, planning, technical information, policy information that I think is important that I understand and or at least receive. I guess the other part about it is I hear a lot of sort of the internal workings of DFO in terms of subcommittees, processes within DFO that perhaps First Nations don't hear, and unless we understand them, then how can we sort of be involved in participating in them? In fact, First Nations in many cases aren't involved in a lot of those processes that I hear about within DFO. But I guess the other part of it is understanding the interests of the commercial and recreational and conservation sectors. It's important to understand their interests in conservation and harvest.
And have you found that to be a valuable aspect of the IHPC then, hearing the other interests and understanding the perspectives of the other sectors?
I think it is valuable, and I guess at some point in the future, just understanding their interests and them understanding mine, hopefully that would inform their decisions and ours about protecting salmon within our own fishing plans. And I've heard that from various sectors at the meetings, and I think that's a value that needs to be sort of heard in terms of understanding where we're coming from in our area of the river.
Thank you. And the Commissioner asked a question which is one I was going to be moving to now in any event, which is capacity for participants in the process, participants in the IHPC process and in the review and development of the IFMP. Do the people that are participating in the IHPC and who are being asked to comment on draft IFMPs have the technical capacity to meaningfully engage in the process, or the human resources to meaningfully engage, and the financial capacity? So there are a couple of different issues there. And I guess in the background, when you're answering that question, if you can reflect on the question posed by the Commissioner, which is, do the participants have the ability to not only understand what's being given to them, but to know what questions need to be asked? Do they have the technical assistance to allow them to ask those questions? And if I could start with Dr. Christensen.
Well, as I indicated earlier, I think we are not unhappy with the ability of our representatives at IHPC to understand the issues that are before them, some of which are technical and most of which relate to harvest planning and harvest methods. And I guess the people that we elect, I think, in looking at who should be there, we're choosing people who we feel have the ability to deal with those issues. I would separate that from the question of whether of whether or not it would be both wise and advisable and a good expenditure of public funds to provide each of the groups that are represented at IHPC with some kind of separate technical support. And frankly, I'm without having thought about it a great deal, I'm not sure that would be a useful expenditure of public funds. Again, given past experience, which is that the more you want to do that, the more you're going to take funds away from the core responsibilities of the department. And so, my vision of the technical support is that a well-funded department with highly qualified staff does the primary technical work. It subjects its technical findings and science to a peer review process called, in the past, PSARC, and now CSAP, an unfortunate acronym. And the other interests can have technical people or others at those PSARC meetings. I've attended many of them. That gives us the ability to understand and question what the department's doing, and out of that comes the advice which flows from science to management in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I think it's a good model. I think it's not adequately supported at present for reasons that are not the fault of the Pacific region, but I would not like to see, at least in our case, resources diverted from that to try and provide what would become inevitably dueling scientific hired guns. And I'm simply not convinced that's a good idea.
I actually don't. My only observation and concern is that many of the individuals that participate in the myriad of consultation fora and meetings are the same people, and there is this issue of fatigue, perhaps, and that there is being an awful lot asked of individuals to participate day after day, week after week, in very similar forums, and I think it's asking an awful lot of individuals, and I know that some people have the demands have been more than they can provide, and some people have, you're starting to see some dropout in some of these processes. I'm very fortunate, quite frankly, in observing the high level of integrity and competency within the individuals that do participate, but one only has to take a look at a 3-page list of the number of meetings that are going to take place over a year relating to just salmon, and realize that the same people are at those same meetings. That it's you got to ask yourself, how long can this take place?
Again, Mr. Matthew.
Well, I guess speaking for myself, and First Nations that may attend that I know of, I don't believe we have the technical capacity to engage in the IHPC as an advisory process. Along with what's been described already, First Nations have limited technical capacity in terms of actual individuals at a Fraser-wide level or within their communities. So it would make sense to me that that capacity has to be sort of consolidated in some place, and I don't think it's at the IHPC that it should occur. I do agree that the pure science of managing fisheries, there needs to be some, I guess, some alignment with DFO and their science, their technical staff and First Nations, and that's occurring at the Fraser watershed level through the FRAFS agency or the FRAFS organization, but I don't see it occurring here. So I see, when I go to the meetings, a lot of the information on fisheries management is presented in a very technical manner, and with, there might be a lot of graphs and things like that, but a lot of the work that's gone on behind that in terms of is, to me, it's not clear, and we need, I think First Nations need to be able to understand it, review it, agree on it, on the processes, the technical processes that are used to, used in the IFM or IHPC and any other process.
Do you think that the sectors need to have a detailed technical understanding of what is being presented in terms of the model outcomes and the model options to actually engage meaningfully in the process? Do they need that deep technical understanding to actually do what they're being asked to do in the IHPC in reviewing the IFMP documents and make decisions for, or provide advice for fishery decision making? Again, start with you, Dr. Christensen.
Well, they certainly need to understand what's in front of them, and I guess that, of course, I suppose my perspective is that I view it as the responsibility of technical people to present their information in ways that can be understood by intelligent people, and I think that using, and so in that context, I think that when the system works appropriately, when people who are technically trained and who have done the work are presenting their information in understandable language, most of us get it. Whether you need to have a detailed technical understanding is, I think, I guess I wouldn't, I don't think that I would like to see an IHPC where where each of the sectors had a technical person behind them who they inevitably had to call on to duel with whoever's presenting the information. I just think that overly complicates things, and I don't think generally that's the way it is. Most of the information that's presented I find to be in an understandable way. Have I had to, in my own personal sense, do some extra reading to discover what the Bayesian approach is? You can't be involved in fisheries science at all before you will have people tell you, well, this information is valid because I subjected it to a Bayesian approach. And my response to those people is to point out to them that the popularizer of the mathematician Bayes approach, of course, said that the approach was valid because it proved the existence of God. And which probably is the appropriate thing to apply to fisheries science. But okay, I'm sorry, I digress. I think that that it is the responsibility of all of us to understand this technical material. If we had more resources, would that be better? Sure. But in terms of what is needed and what's available, I'm not sure I would place that at the top of the list.
Great. Mr. Sato? You may have already answered this question, but...
In my personal opinion, the answer is no. But I come from a slightly different perspective than Dr. Christensen in that models are merely tools. And I think what I need is some confidence that the tool itself operates and functions in the manner that it's intended to. And that if I'm asking it to perform a task, that it performs that task in a reasonable manner. I think without extending too far, extending the question too far, I'm wondering if the question really is, are the people that are responsible for developing and caretaking these models been provided the appropriate communication tools so they are actually able to translate a highly technical and complex subject into something that most all of us should be able to understand and relate to. But I might have gone beyond what the question was asked.
Mr. Matthews, again, you may have covered this already in your prior answer, but is there anything you'd like to add?
I guess about the information that's presented, you mentioned about models and I guess potential outcomes from that, from those models are perhaps described, or various options described that are derived from models. And the problem with that is that the outcomes in choosing, which sort of option, the outcome might have an impact on one stock or another. And First Nations have a concern with that, in that it may mean that you might be establishing a harvest option on a group of stocks or one stock that might impact a stock of concern. And so the question is, how do you trade off fishing a strong stock versus a weaker one? And there's a question of, the outcome might be less fish returning to spawn, which is an impact on conservation, or it might be an impact on an individual community's fishery on that particular stock. So the whole issue of outcomes is, and that is who decides that. And right now, it's for First Nations, it's very difficult for them to understand the models, understand the outcomes, and right now there's no agreed to process at the IHPC or any other place to discuss and understand what those trade-offs are and what the implications are between conservation and harvest, especially for First Nations. And the models that are described about sockeye look at the survival or the productivity 40 years into the future. And for First Nations, that's very difficult to understand, how that might function. And anyways, to me, I think, First Nations, yeah, we do need scientists and technicians, but we really need somebody, or we need to really be clear about what the outcomes are and the trade-offs are. And I don't think DFO is presenting those to us in a fashion that we understand, or how they make those trade-offs in an individual year with their fishing plan.
One of the purposes of the IHPC is to discuss those trade-offs between conservation and harvest and impacts on stocks. Do you not find that is properly or fully discussed in the IHPC?
I don't at all. I don't think we've ever gotten to that, as I recall, that sort of point in the discussion at the IHPC. We've never gotten to the point of talking about trade-offs or the implications, and nor would I even venture as a First Nation representative from my own communities to want to do it there. I don't think that's the right place for First Nations to discuss trade-offs where conservation or their harvest are impacted, or the outcomes might impact those. I don't think that's the right place to do it. And there's got to be another First Nation sort of process to do that that's clearly understood and transparent.
Thank you. A couple of questions about what the role of the province. Mr. Sato, what do you see as the role of the province at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee?
Thank you. The role of the province that I've attempted to serve is to ensure that the fishing plans themselves are sustainable and protect biological diversity, that they achieve that necessary balance between the interest groups, so that the greater good to all British Columbians can be met and served, and also to ensure that there is a balance between the social and the economic objectives in terms of harvests, so that the fishing plans are broadly supported by all.
Mr. Matthew, what do you what do you see the role of what do you see as the role of the province at the IHPC?
I'm not really clear. I guess to me, there's been situations where they may play a role in some of the stocks, like I guess steelhead is one of them. But speaking of the greater good of the public, to me, that's where the sort of the balancing act comes in, and that's where sort of the deep-rooted problem lies in this process. Is it's conservation first in terms of priority, then First Nations priority second, and other sectors, and I imagine the greater good of the public third and last. And so, to me, that's where it just doesn't sort of, I guess, fit in terms of their role and my understanding of it.
Dr. Christensen?
I think it's essential that the province be part of this process, and indeed other processes related to tidal fisheries. Historically, British Columbia was not much interested in these things, and in fact that has changed, and it's changed for the better. I think having the province at the table, because of the fact that it has responsibility for a wide range of activities that impinge upon fisheries ultimately. Water, freshwater supplies in the interior, who gets water, forestry issues, all of those. And so I think if the province wasn't there and ably represented, as I think it has been, then there would be a missing element to all of this. In fact, it could render irrelevant a lot of the discussion that actually does take place. So I think it's a positive thing.
Now, obviously a big part of what happens at the IHPC is the review of draft fisheries, integrated fisheries management plans, the IFMPs. Are you aware of times where there has been a consensus at the IHPC on a decision to be made in the IFMP document where that IFMP was not actually implemented or taken up by the minister? Mr. Sato?
Yes, but I'm struggling because I can't recall the exact minutes, the precise minutes and the days, of the proceedings that where that consensus was reached. But there was a year, and I simply can't remember that year, when there was a preseason forecast for salmon returns that were very poor, and there was a consensus that DFO should consider a license holiday for the commercial fishery. And there was a consensus reached at the IHPC, and that advice is not clear what happened to that advice, but that license holiday, and I put that in brackets, but the license holiday was not responded to in a positive manner.
Dr. Christensen, have you got any?
Well, I was kind of scratching my mind on this one, and I recall the same issue. I think that it had to do with licensing, as I think the answer was that it went to Ottawa, which at the national level was examining a whole set of licensing issues, and this one simply fell into a trough from which it didn't emerge because of these other issues. I mean, there have been other, and I didn't have time to go back and search the minutes to find them, but there have been occasional times when formal consensus decisions were reached, but they usually didn't relate specifically to the fishing plan. They usually related to issues that surround the fishing plan. I think one, I'm right in saying, is support for better integration of the wild salmon policy into the creation of the IFMP, and I think that was, we worked through language that everyone could agree to, but this was really kind of a policy statement as opposed to a specific recommendation. I mean, I think the difficulty, as in any consensus-based forum, the problem is, of course, that interests have a veto. And so there have been a number of occasions when a proposal is made for a consensus. I'm not sure how you do that. Do you move a motion if you're going to try to go to consensus? We've not worked through the dynamics of these things. But where, having had a discussion at the table, it's clear there isn't support, then the issue is dropped because there clearly is not a consensus.
Mr. Matthew?
What was the question, sorry?
Have there ever been examples where there is a consensus at the IHPC on a decision in the IFMP, the draft IFMP, where that IFMP decision was not taken up by the minister?
I'm not clear on the minister's responses to any of the recommendations put forward, license holiday or otherwise. Well, maybe that one is, somebody else is clear about that, but the other recommendations put forward were, somewhat about lobbying for more funding, about stock assessment, and that sort of thing. But I guess the process there is if if you don't say anything or object, then silence is consensus. In other words, so it's very difficult then with the IFMP as the sort of the document that we're trying to agree to or have input to. What do you do then? If you say something on every topic throughout, you know, we never get there. So I guess it's not clear to me, like, what after the IHPC meetings, what actually is sent to the minister in terms of a communication from our group. I think this question has been asked of DFO before. How do you weigh and balance the advice that we put forward from various sectors to the minister, and how is it weighed and balanced? And I don't know that we've ever been responded to in that fashion. And to me, I mean, I think that needs to be clearly understood. Maybe the minister has discretion not to, but it's why would a person continue to go to a process such as this when you know your interests are not accommodated, or there's no description of how much of it is accommodated.
Hearing will now recess for 10 minutes.